Okay. All right. So I'm going to be practicing a lecture that I've made on the topic of strong emergence. And this practice session is mostly for me to get comfortable with speaking about these topics spontaneously, as well as a chance to see whether my slides actually tell the message that I'm trying to convey, and whether the manner of me conveying it is adequate to explain the subject. I'm pretty confident in myself that I'm able to. Let's hold on, move my mic a little bit. That I'm able to explain what's going on here, even to people who this might be new to or have difficulty understanding things in material sciences, because there's a lot of science. There's a lot of scientific concepts involved here. I mean, the first image that you see is the standard model of particles. But I'll get started after that introduction. So the reason this is appearing on your screen is that it's often claimed that this is the lowest level of reality. Okay, so these are the smallest units of existence. As far as we can tell, we haven't discovered anything smaller, although many physicists theorize that there are smaller structures, for example, strings, that can explain in a more harmonious way why these particular particles exist. But we haven't found that level yet, and so it's just speculation that it exists. And so as far as we can tell, this is the lowest level. Okay? And hi, Josh Liska. If this is the lowest level of reality, these constituents can interact with each other to give rise to new phenomena. So for example, if you take two of these up quarks and one of these down quarks, what you can get is this structure here, which is known as a proton. And it involves very complicated dynamics, which are referred to as color charge. And these quarks exchanging color charge is what gives you the proton. So essentially, it's these quarks interacting via this gluon. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. No, you can't. That's fine though. But you can see with the gluon here, and you can see the up and down quarks. So them interacting in a complicated dynamic gives you this new thing called a proton, and the proton has a charge of +1, or +1. And so you can then go back to this diagram and grab a couple of these electrons, and then as well as arrange quarks in a different way to get neutrons, and then you have a structure known as the atom. For a while, we used to think that these were the lowest levels of reality, which made sense. But it turns out there was things lower, protons and neutrons, and then things that were even smaller than that. But you can see then how these various components then interact with each other to give us a brand new thing called an atom. And then atoms have various properties. And I'm not even scratching the surface here when you think about the complexity of different molecules and how crazily complicated molecules can get. But these are some examples of some hydrocarbons. So carbon, which is an atom composed of several electrons, neutrons, and protons, can form these molecules involving hydrogen, a different atom, but then these can then form longer chains of these hydrocarbons. And so you're getting these complicated structures, which are ever increasing in complexity. But now I want to make kind of a jump, because with this complicated structure, and again, it's also a hydrocarbon. This is an organic molecule, and so it is built up from carbon and hydrogen, but it's DNA. And DNA, I want to argue later, and I'll get into more detail, is not... It's very different. It's a different kind of molecule in that it's encoding information. And it's encoding information about a living organism, about the structure of that organism, but it's also engaging in this act of self-preservation. But it's not preserving these particular atoms, let's say. The goal of the DNA, or its teleological orientation, isn't to preserve these specific atoms. It's to preserve what's being encoded by the atoms. So the encoding itself starts to exist apart from the mere atoms. Okay, so what I want to show later is that this is kind of like a new thing in the universe. It's not merely particles. It's a kind of molecular structure built from particles. It emerges from particles, but then it goes on to encode information about other things. And so in that sense, it goes beyond particles. And it also evolves over time. And so there's a sense in which this object called DNA is now subject to new rules which cannot be defined at the lower level. The lower level laws will tell you some information. Sorry, I'm going too far ahead. But it won't tell you how this object will proceed going forward into the future. It's subject to new laws. For example, the law of evolution by natural selection. But what DNA molecules encode are structures for proteins. Now, these are absurdly complex, and they arise from DNA. DNA being transcribed and then translated is what gives you these protein structures. And proteins have a huge variety of different forms. They're built from enormous chains of amino acids, and so in that sense they emerge from amino acids, but then they also begin to fold into various shapes, and these shapes basically, the simplest way to put it is that they become lock and key mechanisms, which then allow them to build other molecules. And so you assemble a whole bunch of these proteins, and then they start getting to work on assembling different molecules. And then those molecules, when arranged into a very particular form, gives you a living cell. Now, a cell itself is emergent from a whole bunch of different structures, which each play a role in the overall makeup of this organism. And so various components is giving rise to a thing which is engaged in this process of resisting entropy. It's maintaining its structure, it's reproducing. It's not, let's say, it doesn't perceive yet. We don't believe that this perceives. And we think of all of this as being dead, right? Like all the components inside here are just kind of objects. But together, when they work together in this very complicated process, it gives rise to a living cell. And so the act of living is something that emerges from matter, but is irreducible because it requires all of these components. And then you have something that's alive and capable of reproducing and capable of resisting entropy, which is very different from how matter normally acts. And then you can get more complicated structures built from cells. So you can take individual cells and then arrange them in ways where you can get more complicated organisms, where each cell starts to work with the other cells to create this kind of cohesive structure. We're getting new phenomena which are built from from these smaller units. Or rather these larger units that keep arising from smaller units. And so this is an example of a very simple single-celled organism made up of a few hundred cells. But then you can get to organisms that, this is also microscopic, but you can see that it's made up from various different structures. And so each individual cell is now specializing. And that specialization is giving this whole collection of cells, new properties and new abilities and new capacities. And so all of these things are working together, performing a different role, and then the overall structure is this brand new thing. And then you can just think about the diversity of life on Earth and just how the various different forms that this simple process can give rise to, and the way life evolves, and the way these brand new kind of entities can start to exist in our universe, which are so ridiculously complicated and so ridiculously different from each other that it's hard to fathom. But then we also have processes of emergence which take place kind of at new scales and kind of new domains of knowledge, where it's not just particles building upon particles, but what's happening within particular particle arrangements. I can give a simple example before I move on of like your organ systems and like the nervous system or the immune system. Like it's an entire system within an organism that has properties. The property of being immunity, the property of being a defensive shield against foreign agents, such as bacteria, viruses, whatever, that are trying to infiltrate your body. And so this new thing starts to exist. And the point I'm trying to get across is that these new kind of domains of existence, when you start from physics and then you get to chemistry and then you get to biology, these new things that emerge start to exist by different laws that are irreducible to the smallest components. Or at least that's what I'm going to argue. I'm probably kind of jumping the gun here. About what this is going to be about. But let's get back to the idea of like the nervous system, because this very complicated structure, which involves electrical impulses and very complicated biochemical signaling, gives rise to experience. And so experience and qualia and consciousness and sentience and anything that a living being can experience is starting to emerge from this very complicated dynamic of cells interacting and processing information very quickly. And you can see just like this schematic of our nervous system in the brain, just how complicated the wiring is here, and how many different connections. And it's really the connections that are are really there's a vast quantity of them in the brain, versus like individual cells. It's the way they're connected that really gives rise to this insanely complex structure. But that insanely complex structure then gives rise to mental concepts, and cognition, and the ability to think, and your internal monologue, and the ability to be creative and come up with ideas, and like create abstract representations. So abstract representations, which exist inside your mind, are kind of like emerging from your nervous system. And I would say that they constitute a new thing. So yes, your nervous system is taking part in this process of generating something, but that something, which is, let's say, a mental concept, exists in and of its own right. It emerged from the activity of neurons, but once it emerges, it kind of has a life of its own, and can influence the world, and is real and has real causal effectivity. But let's say it's not the entire picture, let's say, in the whole chain of causal evolution. Go back. Humans themselves, so we looked at individual organisms, but then the organisms themselves can arrange themselves into into larger structures such as entire societies or entire nations. And so, it's impossible to create a society out of a single human. A society naturally involves the cooperation of many humans living together in a very complicated network and a complicated set of dynamics, which gives rise to this new thing called a society. So even a society, in a sense, seems irreducible to the individual humans. It's something that emerges from many humans and then is more than the sum of its parts, and is capable of doing more than just than what the sum of its parts are capable of, or potentially less. But then we want to think about other phenomena in the universe, because so far what we've been discussing seems to be, apart from the abstract mental concepts, appear to be material, in the sense that you could imagine how each of these things is just a material object at its kind of lowest level. But then what about something like economics? Like, is economics a real phenomenon that exists in the universe? And if it is, can it be reduced to matter? Because if you think about it, economics involves things like value and human subjective feelings of value. And so without that value, without that kind of metaphysical relationship you have with a piece of paper that you call money, the movement of that money will not be predictable. It involves things which aren't exactly physical, and involve kind of like imaginary humans engaging in this kind of imaginary act, which results in this thing called economics. But then what about other phenomena? What about something like language? Where does language exist in the universe? Because I'm referring specifically to the kind of grammatical, lexical language that humans use. And what kind of a phenomenon is it? Because if you think about it, language, it kind of exists in everybody's collective agreement that these words and these particular sounds in this arrangement conveys meaning. So we all agree, the speakers of a particular language agree that it's these particular sounds which correspond to those particular meanings. And so the language that we speak is kind of distributed in a network of all the humans that speak that language. And it's their agreement or even disagreement that causes the language to evolve and causes the language to exist. So even this seems to be distributed in a way that's not exactly material. You can argue that it's material because it's involving neurons in everybody's brain, but I think you can show that this isn't the case, because a completely different arrangement of neurons in your head, if you're an English speaker, might give rise to the same meaning that I understand from a completely different arrangement of neurons in my head. So the neurons are interchangeable, but it's still producing meaning. And so meaning itself must be something above and beyond matter. Let me know if you agree. I see I have 6 viewers, and if that makes sense, if you agree with the idea that language must be something above matter or beyond matter. Again, matter is not irrelevant to the picture. Matter facilitates all of this, but then you get these phenomena which start to exist in their own domain. And so there's ways to approach these domains that don't involve matter at all. And in fact, you can completely ignore it because you have these higher level concepts operating at a higher level where matter is just kind of playing a facilitative role. And so you don't really need to account for it. You don't need to account for the motion of particles in order to engage in the activity of linguistics, for example. Moving on, what about a thing like music? What kind of domain does this occupy? And in fact, even any kind of art or literature or like movies, what kind of phenomena are these? And in what sense can they be called material? Because they exist in the universe, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly where the matter is if you were to consider this to be a purely material phenomena. What about something like science, which is a human activity, right? Like it's not just the fact that the universe abides by certain laws. It's the ability um, to engage in a process of determining those laws and observing reality. And so it's a human activity. It's like the universe becoming aware of itself through this process of creating mental concepts which correspond to the universe, and then using observations and data to check which of these abstractions applies to the universe. So what exactly, what kind of a phenomenon is science? Like the activity of science, the engaging in science. And then what about our technology? Things like our computers and the crazy amount of wiring and levels of abstraction that exist here, because even the components of a computer arise from smaller components, and then we get this very complicated behavior arising from very simple components at the lowest levels. So what kind of domain of existence is occupied by things like our technology? Let's move on. So, as I've shown from the very first slide, is that these phenomena appear to arise from fundamental physics. So at the very lowest level, we have those fundamental quarks, up quark, down quark. I should probably have this view open. Yeah, so we have these fundamental quarks, and it appears that everything that I've discussed arises from these. So the question we want to ask is would you be able to predict the behavior of these higher level systems such as what happens in a computer, the activity of science, music, language, economics, society, human mentality, all of these higher level concepts? Would you be able to predict them? Would you be able to perfectly predict what was going to happen within these systems just by looking at the particles? Is the particle information enough to determine what's going to happen within these systems? So for example, like human behavior, if I could just look at each of the individual particles that comprises a human, and I don't need to look at like anything higher. So like, for example, you might be tempted to say, let's look at the DNA, right? But you don't actually have to look at the DNA, because the DNA is itself made from smaller particles, which were made from smaller particles. So if you could just look at those individually, would that be enough information? Given the laws which govern their interactions, would that be enough information to tell you how a human is going to behave? Okay, and we want to do this from the lowest level. Now, there's kind of a difference between the epistemological question and the metaphysical question. So the epistemological question, I think, is this possible in principle? And the answer is probably no. Like a human is just like, we're getting to the level of so many particles that if we try to predict the behavior of a human from just like plugging it into a computer simulation using the fundamental laws and what we know about them, like the computer's just going to break. Like we don't have enough computing power to actually check that. Okay, so in principle it's not possible. Okay, but is it possible in principle? In practice it's not possible. Is it possible in principle? Well, the idea of physicalism or physical reductionism or materialism or materialist reductionism is that all phenomena, everything that exists in the universe is, first of all, is fundamentally material, and so it can be reduced to fundamental physics. The reason we don't reduce everything to fundamental physics is just because it's a matter of computational inefficiency. So, for example, if I describe a frog's behavior, in terms of it has the purpose of survival, like it wants to survive. Like that's just me kind of putting a mental abstraction over what is actually just matter doing what matter does. Like that's just a way to simplify it. Okay, so it doesn't exist in and of its own sense. So that's the position of physical reductionism. So what that position would say then is that this equation, this is the standard model Lagrangian. So it's basically just the equation, the real form of the equation is much longer. This is just a simplified one. But the idea is you plug in your particles into this equation, and you get an answer which tells you how the particle is going to move. So it's basically just a relationship between the particle's current state, which you plug in, and then how it evolves over time. You might have questions about quantum mechanics or whether that factors in. It does factor in, and quantum mechanics is a source of randomness. But these laws, these Lagrangians, are still deterministic. Like even if there is like quantum probability involved, these laws are still deterministic in that they give you information about how an electron will evolve. for example. So is this enough information, assuming you applied it to every single particle in the universe? Would this just tell you everything that's going to happen? Would this tell you what's going to happen in economics, like how the stock market will evolve over time? Will that be resultant from this? And I would argue that in principle, there are certain systems that cannot be entirely predicted from lower level laws. In principle, as in, it doesn't actually, even if you tried to derive these from lower level laws, what you'll find, you'll get the wrong answer essentially, because there are it's not just a matter of computational inefficiency. It's not as if the reason we're getting the wrong answers is because we just don't have strong enough computers to do this for every single particle. It's that if you did this for every single particle, you would get the wrong answer because there are things happening which exist at higher levels and then influence those things at lower levels. Okay, so there's this kind of a link of causation between the higher level system and the lower level system, such that the lower level system has been altered, and so I can't use like the base lower level system to predict what's going to happen. I have to use like an altered version of that, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But anyway, such systems are considered strongly emergent, such that they have properties which you cannot. Well, there's a few different ways to put this. Some would say that it's a matter of having properties that were not possible to predict beforehand, and that's true, but that kind of muddies it. The more fundamental thing is that if I were to use the lower level laws to predict how such a system would evolve, I would be missing information. There's things happening at a higher level that need to be accounted for in order to get the right answer at the lower level. And so such systems are considered strongly emergent. And there's a lot. I'm glad this is a practice run because there's a lot to discuss and a lot going on here. We have concepts like irreducibility, where like, for example, a new phenomenon, like a brand new phenomenon, it only exists when all of the constituent parts are there for it to exist. Okay, so the example that I always use is life. Okay, so like you are living, right? You're engaged in the act of living. Now you can either see that as an abstraction, like you're not actually alive, but because every single one of your particles is not alive, so the whole thing is not alive. The idea of you being alive is just kind of like a mental tool we use to describe what you are. But what I'm saying is living is an actual thing, like it's a real thing, and you can tell because it's very clear when something is dead. You see? Because if living wasn't a real thing, the kind of line between death and being alive would be very blurred. But in my opinion, it can be sometimes blurred in very particular instances, but in most cases, if you remove somebody's heart, they're going to die and they're dead. They need a heart in order to live. And so there's a sense in which there's all these components within them that need to go together to give you the overall quality of living. And so it's irreducible to these levels. Another aspect of this is something called multiple realizability, which is when higher level phenomena can actually arise from various different lower level organizations. So like, for example, what we call living might exist on another planet, but use entirely different laws. Like it might not be carbon-based, for example, but we would still consider it alive because it's kind of meeting all the criteria we have for life in biology. And so it makes sense to call it alive, even if it looks quite different from what we consider normal life. And so that's the position of strong emergence. And how this works in the kind of causal matter is that we have at the lower levels here matter. So matter is what's at the very lowest level, but then these give rise to things like life, mind, and culture. And you can think of these as existing in this kind of like upward-downward relationship, where particles are the smallest things, and then things like cultures are the biggest things, but then even like abstract ideas are still kind of higher than these lower level things. And then we have a kind of chains of causations between these. So the matter in the world is kind of influencing culture, obviously, right? Like the culture of a place that's rich in a particular mineral, they might have like a mining culture around that. And so like the matter in the world is influencing culture, sure. But then culture, this higher level thing, is also influencing matter, because now, for example, those precious metals from wherever you live, they're being valued by human minds that understand economics and that understand other higher principles. So the mind and culture is now influencing the way matter moves. So you have this kind of chain of causation between these higher levels and lower levels that all equally exist. Okay, so it's not just a matter of, because physicalists would just say that it's this matter, this upward kind of causation, that's the real causation, and then everything else is just epiphenomenal. But really, it's just a matter. But no, it's not. It's actually not possible for that to be the case, because these higher level things do exist and are shown to have causal influences upon matter. For another good example would be like your morality. So morality is something that exists in your mind. Again, it arises from neurological interactions within your brain, but in and of itself can influence your behavior. So whatever exists in your mind, whatever exists abstractly, is now influencing your behavior. Now you might think like, well, it's not really influencing your behavior. It's just the neurons that cause you to behave that way, and then you experience a sense of morality. But at the lower level, it's actually just the neurons that are firing. Now, what I would say is that yes, you can account for much behavior on account of neurons just doing what neurons do, but sometimes those neurons interact in a way that's so complicated that it gives rise to something new. And there are certain human behaviors that are impossible to explain unless you have these higher level things existing. So morality has to exist, because if it didn't exist in an abstract way, there would be no way for it to influence people's behavior. But clearly, if one culture preaches one morality and a different culture preaches a different morality, that leads to different behavior. Humans are themselves going to act differently because of this abstract thing called morality, and you can't explain that if you just say morality in and of itself isn't real. It must be real in some sense. It's not real in a material sense. And this is another error, is to assume that everything that's real has to be matter. But things like culture, things like mental abstractions, things like economics, and even things like encoding and like different ideas, like for example, evolution by natural selection. These are processes that exist, that can't be reduced to pure matter and can't even be predicted on the basis of pure matter. Things like consciousness, let me get my thing back up here. So things like mental concepts, they appear to exist in a different space relative to matter. So matter is kind of facilitating abstraction and mental concepts and even perception and anything you experience. Experience itself is given as one of like the classic examples of strong emergence, where it's impossible in principle to understand how any arrangement of matter gives you experience, but experience does exist. It's so perplexing that it seems to be strongly emergent just in principle. But you can also show that it's strongly emergent using some logical arguments to show that, first of all, it must have causal effectivity. So your consciousness does actually influence the world. It's not just this epiphenomenal thing. And you can show, for example, what's another good argument for the strong emergence of consciousness, that a system that can be predicted by referring to the motion of particles and the dynamics by which particles are governed will not behave the same way under the influence of consciousness. I think that's in my opinion, that's completely trivial. Like anytime you pick up an object, like it's like, for example, that object normally goes down because of gravity, but you've picked it up because you've used your mind to control your arm to pick it up. And so there's a sense in which whatever physics you used to understand the motion of that behavior priorly are no longer applying because of a conscious entity interacting with that thing. So in my opinion, that shows strong emergence. It doesn't really prove it though. But I would say that if you can link mental concepts with something that's different. So if we go back to economics, economics involves value, right? It involves like these things that you're looking at, these pieces of paper, like they're signed, they're marked, they're very elaborate. These coins, they're very decorative. Why? Right? Like it's because we've put value into these objects. Our mentality is bleeding into the way these objects appear to our minds. And the fact that they appear differently to our minds means that the motion of these objects, it doesn't make sense to try to explain the way money moves from particle physics. Like, it just doesn't, because a thing called a value, which exists in our minds in an abstract space, will influence the way these things move. And you can imagine economics is just one example. It's a particularly strong example because of the way we value money. But anything which your mind has a particular relationship to, anything you understand, like if you understand your car and understand how it works, that kind of itself, your mental understanding will now influence your car. I know it's a weird way to put it, but it's for the purpose of showing what strong emergence is. So hopefully that, let me just see what's going on here. So hopefully that will give you a sense of what downward causation means, like why it makes sense to attribute properties to higher level concepts, and then act as if those properties are real. They're not just abstractions. They're not just mental concepts we create to explain unexplainable physics. This isn't all just physics. But this occurs at even more interesting levels, I would say, because you would think that DNA, like I mentioned earlier in the lecture, why DNA is so fascinating, but you would think that something like DNA is purely material, right? Like these are all atoms, these are all like molecular structures. And so they make sense in that way. And so you can see how DNA works from a material perspective. Now, that isn't wrong. That isn't like, you're not saying something that's incorrect. But what I would say is, even though the matter facilitates what's going on here, what's going on is that you've given this molecule a new property which doesn't apply to lower level physics. So like what's going on at this level of physics with these very simple constituents is no longer applicable. Like, it's no longer not applicable. It does apply at the material sense, but it doesn't apply to like the higher level effects that are going on here. So let me give you a sense of what these are. So for example, DNA is subject to evolution through natural selection, okay? So it changes. And why does it change? Why does DNA change? It changes because of randomness. So like when a DNA strand replicates, it generates, first of all, this is not trivial at all. So like there's deeper levels to this that I can explain soon, but just bear with me. When a DNA replicates, it creates a new strand of DNA, which is supposed to look like the opposite strand of the DNA that it's replicating from. So basically, DNA is a double helix, and then the helix unwinds, and then you can get a new pair of DNA molecules from each helix. But sometimes this process doesn't go correctly, and a random a coding error will occur. So the code isn't copied exactly. Now, these coding errors can give rise to different proteins that have different properties, and these properties might be advantageous. So if the property leads to something that will allow the organism which carries that DNA to propagate itself into the future, it will survive. Like in an entropy sense, it will continue to survive. That DNA will have a more likely will be more likely to continue its existence. And so it's this ever-evolving thing, and all the DNA in your body has been shaped by millions of years of evolution. And so, but to think about what's going on there. Like, there are parts of your DNA that are probably extremely ancient, going back to the very dawn of life, which allowed life to survive. But then you have all this new DNA that's evolved. So in one sense, your DNA is like preserving information from way in the past. Like way in the past, like if I looked at a random up quark and like tried to understand like its dynamics over time by looking in the past, like there's no way I could predict it. But DNA, like you could see the way it moves through time. It's very different from other particles. In that its structure, its encoding survives over time. It's not the molecule itself. So another thing that's going on here is that because of encoding information, again, the idea of encoding information is like a brand new phenomenon. It's not reducible to mere fundamental physics. DNA is a special kind of molecule that can encode information, and encoding is beyond matter. Like, it can't be reduced to matter. And I can prove this because if you take two identical pieces of DNA, there's a sense in which they're identical, even though they're made of different matter. And they have exactly the same information with respect to the biological organism that they'll produce, but they're made of completely different molecules. Okay, is that generally true of other molecules? Like, no, like these two equivalent strands of DNA will produce the same entity. And so they have the same information, but they have different matter. Okay, so there's information that's beyond matter being contained in the DNA. Okay. And again, this involves, I forgot to finish my point earlier, is that this involves random processes. So like random mutations will take place that alter the DNA. And that process itself, because it's random, can't be predicted beforehand. Because again, we're assuming that we're using these deterministic laws to derive everything that happens at a higher level. But in reality, this is showing properties which don't exist at this lower level. The encoding that's going on here and its relationship to the production of biological structures, specifically proteins, is a brand new phenomenon which means that its evolution through time going forward will not be predictable just from these fundamental laws. But I would even argue that examples of weak emergence, where you can in theory predict what's going to happen from just these lower level laws. For example, it's often claimed that atoms are like that. Like you understand how these fundamental particles interact with each other, and then that'll tell you how an atom will interact. An atom will behave. But what I would say is that like individual atoms themselves begin to show new properties, and like regardless of whether you could predict this from the lower level laws, you're getting a whole bunch of different phenomena. All of these different atoms, all of these different elements, which are again just one nucleus and a whole bunch of electrons, they start to show different properties. That's why they can be grouped in this way on this periodic table, is that each of these individual things starts to have its own properties because of the way it's arranged. So like, yeah, you can paint a picture of how the lower level or the higher level arises from the lower level, but then you still get these brand new properties as a result of this lower level phenomena. And again, whether these are weakly emergent or strongly emergent is a matter of great debate. But just to be clear, nobody has actually been able to prove that like, for example, the dynamics of a proton necessarily follow from what's going on at the lower level. They're still trying to calculate it, so it could be weak, but it could also be strong. Nobody's been able to show it yet. And so this isn't as settled a matter as physicalists often assume. Now, let me see. Okay, so so generally we can call a phenomenon strongly emergent if that phenomenon occupies its own domain of knowledge. Okay, so you need new concepts and ideas in order to explain what's going on and explain how that system will evolve. So in economics, you need brand new concepts which don't really like apply to individual particles. In biology, for example, you need the concept of life. Like life, the idea of living doesn't apply to individual particles. Somehow arrangements of particles that are very complicated can give rise to a phenomenon we call life, living, but that property doesn't exist in the fundamental particles themselves. Now we get to a question where this is kind of the interface of the physicalist perspective and the strong emergence perspective, is that isn't it possible that these higher level concepts, like consciousness, for example, are just like, like something, any kind of like fields, like the laws of biology, for example. Couldn't it be that these higher level concepts are ways for our minds to simplify what's actually very complicated math at the lower level? So at this lowest level, it's basically just a mathematical description, right? Like it's just math. It's just these particles having certain values and parameters, and then the mathematics which tells you how these particles will interact with each other. So it's just a kind of mathematical description. But is it possible that this mathematical description is just so complicated and so computationally intensive that you could actually predict what's going to happen at higher levels from that math? It's just impossible in principle because of how much you'd have to do, because like a human being would be composed on the order of like, I don't even know, like like quadrillions of particles. And so doing the math for all the particles is just insane. So isn't it possible that we just kind of simplify things? Well, any phenomenon where this is exactly true and exactly correct is a weakly emergent phenomenon, where so for example, if you want to know how an atom will behave, if I just did all of the computations for the fundamental particles which that atom is made up of, would that tell me how the atom behave? It's possible, right? Like it's not impossible. And so that phenomenon would be a weakly emergent phenomenon. But we know for a fact that there are cases of strong emergence where this is not possible. Okay, it's actually just not possible to use the math at the lower level to get to the higher level. And it's because something exists at that higher level, some kind of phenomenon, some kind of thing. Like, for example, a molecule. You have to think, like, a molecule can't just be considered a bunch of atoms. It's now a new thing, a new individual, a new entity. And this has properties, and it follows laws. And some of those laws can be shown to have a downward causal influence on lower laws. Okay, so it's not just that physics at the lower level is giving rise to emergent phenomena at the higher level. Those emergent phenomena at the higher level are also having a causal influence on the way the downward level laws affect the lower level laws. The way they behave is being altered by these higher level concepts, which exist at a different kind of scale, and we have to consider these phenomena to be real. Okay. So when a strongly emergent phenomenon comes into existence, okay, it might have been possible to show that phenomenon would exist from the lower level laws, but from that point on, from its existence onwards, the evolution of that entire system will no longer be predictable from lower level laws, because new higher level laws apply to the way it behaves, and these do not make sense at the lower level. Okay, so like I was saying before, things like biology, actually the next slide talks about this. Okay, so like new concepts have to be introduced into the field of biology, which have no equivalent in fundamental physics. Okay, so like the idea of evolution by natural selection. Living things are subject to change over time through evolution. This process, like, it doesn't really make sense. It's not a fundamental physics process, right? Because it involves stochasticity, so randomness, random mutations. It also involves things like survival and like teleological orientation and purpose. Like, a living organism has a purpose. Its purpose is to survive, right? You can say, like, there's a sense in which it doesn't actually have a purpose. It just appears to have a purpose, but really just matter being matter. But what we're saying is that, like, no, actually, in order to account for the way it behaves, you have to take into account that purpose to survive. It's not just matter being matter. A new thing with new properties has emerged, and this collective holistic system, which is comprised of many particles, is a new thing in the universe. Like, it's not just reducible to particles. It's this brand new thing, and the way it behaves will now accord with laws which exist at a higher level, which have kind of been introduced into the universe. Okay, so it's actually rather amazing. This is actually very remarkable that something like life can exist in the universe at all, because it kind of rewrites laws of the universe, or creates new laws. It creates new domains of existence, which are equally real. Like, things happening at the cellular level are equally real within these organisms. But all of that together emerges to give us a brand new organism, a brand new phenomenon, which is subject to different laws and different kind of different kind of behaviors. Like, that's very clear, right? Like, look at any living organism. If you have your pet dog around somewhere, like, look at it. Like, it's a very different kind of thing than just matter, right? Like, it's alive, it's conscious, or it's aware of its environment, but it's also engaged in metabolism. It's also engaged in cellular reproduction at the molecular level. It's engaged in all of these crazy processes, and all together that gives you a phenomenon known as a living organism. And so there's many reasons to think why life is very, very different from pure matter. It's a brand new phenomenon which exists in the universe. But they also, living things also engage in other processes like reproduction, which is when they create new copies of themselves. And so the information that exists within an organism has a way to preserve itself. And again, it's the information. This is a point I really want to hammer home. We'll see if any of my next pictures show that. DNA, no. Okay, so DNA, like the DNA is the kind of fundamental building block of living things. And what's happening with DNA is not merely a physical phenomenon. It involves a kind of abstraction of an organism. So DNA is like a code, like a kind of writing, a language that talks about an organism. So this natural molecule which is physical, is engaged in a new kind of behavior, which is encoding the structure of a living organism. And it's that code which survives the process of evolution. It's not the individual particles that make up the code, it's the coding itself. Because, like for example, one of these frogs arose from a certain amount of DNA, right? Like the DNA is what gave rise to the frog, okay? Now those molecules which made up that DNA, probably by the time the frog has fully developed into a frog and is ready to reproduce, that DNA is probably long gone. Like the matter that made up that DNA is long gone, but the code still exists because other molecules contain that same information. And so the information still exists, but the particles themselves may have been rearranged or reshuffled or even lost. So the particles can like evolve, can disappear, but the coding, the thing that goes above and beyond the particles, continues to exist. Okay, and that means that the way that DNA and the fact that it preserves itself over time, something else is preserving itself over time. It's not the individual molecules, it's like the structure of the molecules, the code which the molecules represent. That's the thing that survives and evolves over time. And again, living things engage in behaviors which, like, it's hard to explain just from the level of physics, like predation, like an animal eating another animal in order to survive. Like this is something different. Like it's the world that we're observing, the natural world that we observe. We see lots of things that occur that like it's just kind of weird to be like it's just particles moving in a particular way. Like no, this is a very complicated behavior involving like think about like the evolution of predation. Like which animal was the first to start like hunting other animals rather than just eating stationary plants, or like just getting its energy from in a different way. So it's this brand new thing, and it creates this incredibly complicated dynamic of an evolutionary arms race between prey animals finding ways to survive and hide and change color, and predatory animals evolving new ways to detect that prey. Again, a brand new thing, and you have to think about it in that way. And reducing all of this to physics it's not just oversimplifying things, it's literally incorrect. And that's how we have to think about it, because higher level laws do exist on their own. Here again, like the idea of reproduction, of like retaining itself and surviving over time. It's the DNA that's surviving over time, but it's the code of the DNA, the thing which the DNA represents that's surviving more so than the individual molecules. And hopefully, like I find that very fascinating, and hopefully you guys do as well. Now let's see what happens next. So we can talk even more about evolution and the way, because it's not, so I described DNA so far as encoding the structure of an organism, but it's not just that. It also encodes general information about the environment. So the environment itself is having an influence on the way DNA evolves. Okay, so it's encoding information about the environment, and the environment is having a causal influence on the types of DNA that get expressed. So what that essentially means is that there's a downward causal influence from the environment itself into DNA. Okay, so you can think of the environment as being a holistic entity, right? Like the environment, it's the general temperature, the availability of water, the amount of sunlight. These are all things that are in the environment, but they're all general, right? Like they're composed of particles, but like the general features of the environment is what is being influenced by DNA. So that's an example of a holistic system. Having an influence on the way particles are structured, and things like the fact that life can resist entropy. So entropy is like one of the most fundamental laws in the universe, which basically states that everything tends towards disorder. But living organisms are things which are highly structured and highly ordered. And so there's a sense in which they're not exactly following the laws of entropy, but actually using entropy to kind of using the laws of entropy to kind of sustain themselves and resist entropy. So they're resisting entropy. Now you can argue that in the grand scheme of the universe, entropy is still going up, because this process of resisting entropy also creates more entropy in other parts of the universe. So overall entropy is going up, but still at this small scale, you have a thing kind of resisting what's a natural law. And so you should consider the dynamics of that system at the scale at which it applies, because you can see at the scale of a human being is resisting entropy and has this very complicated structure which allows it to maintain itself for a number of years and then possibly pass on those traits to a new cell which does the same thing. So again, very complicated, very interesting processes, which don't make sense from the perspective of fundamental physics. Now, like things like, and you can think about this more generally, like things that humans do and human behavior. And to think of all of human behavior as reducible to the motion of particles kind of doesn't make sense when you think about something like creativity or like crafting. Like this guy crafts this statue. He carves this statue from wood. He did that for a number of factors, none of which are physical. So, for example, one factor could be that he envisioned this particular drawing in his mind. So his mind created like a mental abstraction, and then he took a piece of wood and started shaping that abstraction into reality. So a mental phenomenon is now influencing something that humans are doing. And other things like the skill he has to carve this wood. He probably gained it through practice, right? And so he probably had to deliberately practice. So he had to force himself to do something, which, you know, whenever you practice something new, it feels kind of weird and your body is unused to it. And you need to kind of push hard in order to gain the dexterity to do it, even something like drumming or playing an instrument. So you're forcing yourself to do something in order to rewire the neurons in your brain. So like a concept, like the idea of practice, which is abstract, is influencing things at the neuron level. Okay, so neurons themselves are being influenced by this higher thing that exists. It's not just the neurons causing your consciousness to exist, it's also your consciousness having this other influence upon the way your neurons are wired. And then other things like human creativity and like making music. Like if somebody wants to become a drummer, like the idea of drumming, like everything about drums is physical, but then like the idea of being a drummer is just like a mental abstraction that you invent. You create it for yourself. You create this idea of like, maybe in the future I could be a drummer. Okay. So it's just mental and it's completely abstract. And then if you pursue this idea, if you put the particles that make up your body into motion to pursue this metaphysical thing, you can start to become a drummer. Right? And like, you can see how there are non-physical things involved in that process. And like things like romance and like finding a partner and finding a partner to reproduce with. Like these are things that, again, don't exactly occur at the particle level. They involve things like emotions and a great deal of cognition, but then also like experiences like love, like the experience of love or the experience of joy. These things are influencing what you do, but they appear to exist on a plane that exists independently of particles, perhaps given rise or starting to exist because of particles, but then they start to occupy their own domain of causation. Now let me just quickly see if there's any... Oh, 3 viewers, not bad. Okay. Let's continue. I can see I probably should have been making notes. There's a lot of things that... a lot of ways in which this lecture is not how I originally intended, but that's why we practice. Okay, now I've already discussed at length how consciousness itself must have causal efficacy despite not being physical. And again, sometimes people disagree with this and just say like, well, consciousness is physical, right? Because it's just like if you take a whole bunch of neurons and wire them up the way that your brain is constructed, that just has consciousness. Like that particular arrangement of matter just has consciousness. But like regardless of the picture that you paint at the material level, because you can paint that picture. You can just show a whole bunch of neurons wiring with each other and even engaged in things like computational processes. Although computational processes themselves are arguably strongly emergent, but nevertheless, you can still see like how matter is involved in all of this. And that wouldn't be an incorrect picture. Like you would have a picture, right? But it's just not the whole picture. There are things that emerge from these processes which themselves must be regarded as causally effective. They themselves are capable of doing things and kind of changing the trajectory of the universe themselves. Like they don't just appear from all of this. They're not just like they're not epiphenomenal. They don't just kind of, your consciousness doesn't just appear from all of the activity in your brain. It in of itself does something. It uses the neurons in your brains to be able to change your behavior. For example, if you're conscious of like of the smell of smoke somewhere, right, like in your house, like that information entered your brain as an experience, and now you're aware that something is burning in your house, your behavior instantly changes. And it's the awareness, and it's like the knowledge and the cognition that influenced your behavior, not just this physical process, although the physical process was there to mediate it. Okay, this is the perspective we're trying to take, and like anybody who spends enough time thinking about their consciousness, this should be extremely obvious. Like nothing I'm saying here should really be that surprising. It's only surprising because of the fact that in recent times in science, we've taken a very strong physicalist perspective, and this perspective, which again is just a perspective, it's not a inherent truth about the universe. It's clouding our ability to see what's in front of us and to be phenomenally entranced with the things that happen in this universe, which are utterly perplexing, and this strong emergence explains why they are utterly perplexing, and why the universe can give rise to so many different unique phenomena. In other words, why the universe is so complicated. And I understand the resistance to an idea like this is because we want to be able to simplify all of reality, because complex things hurt, and it's kind of like annoying when I have to learn new laws at different domains of existence when I can just reduce everything to the smallest laws. But it's just not the way our universe works, and living organisms are strong evidence of that. Like life is so ridiculously strongly emergent that it explains why it's able to evolve into like insane forms, like whales and birds, and like even things that happen at the smallest scales are really perplexing sometimes. Sometimes the things that viruses can do are utterly incredible and utterly amazing, and so we have to resist this temptation to think that everything at its lowest levels is just physics. Physics facilitates all of this, and so physics is important, but it's not the whole picture. Let's say we have to think of holistic systems as having causal powers in and of themselves, and we have to think of this relationship which I'm showing here. So the way that strong emergence is often portrayed is that we have these lower levels of existence. So we can think of like any level that's lower relative to another level. So a general rule, like lower level phenomena are smaller, so like particles, and then the smaller you get, or as you scale up, you can have higher level domains that are higher relative to a lower level domain. So like, for example, proteins are a higher level domain relative to fundamental particles, but they're a lower level domain relative to cells. Okay, and then my whole body, like my human being, let's say, everything that makes me a human, is at a higher level relative to the individual cells in my body. Okay, so causality, the way causality is envisioned is that it's always horizontal. Okay, but then you can have lower level domains causing events in other lower level domains, but then you can also have lower level domains causing events in higher level domains. Okay, so this is emergence. So emergence is when lower level things give rise to higher level phenomena. So they cause them in a sense. Okay, and anytime this happens and it's just this, that's an example of weak emergence. Okay, so it's weak because like it's just a new phenomenon, but the phenomenon itself, like it can just be explained from the higher level. But strong emergence is this situation. Okay, this situation is when that higher level phenomenon has a causal effect upon the lower level domain. Okay, so the lower level domain, whatever was happening there and whatever dynamics govern the motion of the particles or whatever in that domain, they no longer really apply unless you take into account the causal effects which are being caused by the higher level domain. So the higher level domain, it has some kind of property, and that property itself is having an influence on the lower level domain, causing it to react differently. And it's assumed that these things exist together in one system. And if you think about it, the reason why this results in strong emergence is because if I had some laws at the lower level domain, okay, like some physics that tells me how the lower level domain evolves, I could use that physics to show that something at a higher level exists, okay? But then when that higher level thing exists and it's strongly emergent and it has a downward causation, that those lower level laws are no longer the laws that apply in this particular system. Okay, it's because there's something new, which means that the laws need to be changed. Okay, so like this could be simple, like you have to add a new term to your Lagrangian, and now your Lagrangian will give you the right results. Okay, but then where did that modification of the original equation come from? It came from the higher level domain. So the higher level domain must exist in and of itself, and it must be causing the lower level domain to behave differently. This is strong emergence because now there's no way for me to use the raw lower level domain laws to get to the higher level and explain what's going on. You need to add some more information. So adding that more information will give you the correct picture, but then what that reveals is that the higher level domain has causal power. It really exists, and it must really be accounted for in order to explain what's going on at the lower level. Okay. Funny enough, when I was doing research for all of this, it turns out that Aristotle had already discovered the idea of strong emergence, although he didn't call it strong emergence. Instead, what he discovered or what he believed, which is kind of a surprising thing to understand when you realize that Aristotle himself was one of the ones who discovered strong emergence early on. But the way he formulated it is that he believed that holistic systems have causal powers in and of themselves. Okay, so he had what he called the four causes. I probably should have made a note from here for me to remember what these were. But we have something like the formal cause, which is just what an object is made of. I think the material cause, the temporal cause, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but basically where that object came from. So like the time in the past, like the events in the past, which led to this object existing. Okay. And then he believed in a final cause, which or even like a teleological cause. This is probably a good point where I need to make some more notes. Oh yeah, I can't do it. I can't edit it right now. Maybe I should actually. Excusez-moi. Okay. Let's leave this up here so that you can see. Oh no, that's not where I want it to be. Okay. But essentially, Aristotle discovered that higher level systems do themselves have causal influence. So you have to think of a holistic system as having a causal influence upon anything. So for example, let's see if a chair is a good example. A chair, like, obviously is made of matter. It obviously came into existence because somebody made it. But now it kind of serves a purpose, right? Like the purpose of a chair is for somebody to sit on it. And that purpose isn't to be found in the matter. It's to be found in the whole structure that is the chair. So the causal power of the chair, like you would kind of say in a sense that a chair causes a person to sit in it, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because like you won't just, if you walk into a room and you saw an object shaped like a chair and you saw an object shaped like a dog, you wouldn't just go ahead and sit on the dog, like the chair, the structure of the chair is involved in your decision to sit on that object. So like it itself is having a causal influence because of the whole thing, the whole structure, not like the individual pieces, but the whole thing is having causal influences. So this isn't even that radical. Aristotle discovered it a long time ago. There's some subtleties that I should probably try to illuminate. Let's see if there's any questions for viewers. Nobody has questions, there are some questions. I see matter itself as a process of relationship. So both matter and language have shared roots as such. Yes. So this is the reciprocity is required. Exactly. Yeah. So language has to kind of have as a fundamental basis the conditions for language to exist. And those conditions are the material world. Okay. But then once language starts to exist, it starts to operate by different laws, which if you just focused on the material sense, you wouldn't really be capturing a lot of the dynamics there. You would be capturing something, like the physical constitution that makes it possible for language to exist, but you wouldn't be capturing, like, for example, how language changes over time, or communication, like how it's possible for me and you to share meaning using words that that we agree have these particular meanings. Well, another incidental Dune reference, chair dogs. I remember chair dogs. I remember being very outraged at the existence of chair dogs in Dune. Like, what? Okay, anyways, let's get back to what's on this screen. So what I want to convey by this is that there are multiple levels of higher domains, like multiple, and nobody knows what the limit is. Like, it can just keep going, and there being higher and higher and higher domains that emerge from lower domains, and again, have causal influences. And again, these causal influences can be very dynamic. So you can have a lower level domain giving rise to a higher level domain. So like, the example that I use here is the relationship between DNA and a person. Like, the DNA gives rise in a causal fashion to the structure that is a person, okay? But then a person themselves occupies a different level, a different domain, okay? And then a person is embedded within a thing called a society, and they are a part of that society, so they are constituent, just like a cell is a constituent of your body, but you can see how this thing called a society, which is a holistic entity comprised of many thousands of individuals, then has a causal influence on the person. Okay, so you have a higher level system influencing the person. A good example would be like the language you speak, right? Like the culture and society around which you are surrounded has an influence on the language that you're speaking. Okay, so if you're born somewhere else, you'll speak a different language, and so society as a whole is influencing the thing called a human. Okay. But that thing called a human, and even the kind of co-relationship, the co-causal relationship between society and the person, can then influence your DNA, very surprisingly, through processes like methylation, which actually influences the structure of your DNA and which DNA is expressed. So there can be multiple levels, each having different causal influences upon each other. Like, it's very clear, for example, that genes influence culture, but it becomes less apparent that culture influences genes, and yet it does. Culture does influence genes through processes which are very interesting. And so you have to really give each of these domains a sense of reality. Like, they're not just abstractions that we create to simplify the picture. They themselves objectively exist, and you know they objectively exist because they start to do things which don't make sense from the mathematics of just fundamental particles. Okay, so I've been kind of preaching for the past hour, and by that I mean that I've been giving you my opinion, and I've been giving you what I believe, and explaining. I mean, obviously, like, I'm not the only one who believes this. Explaining the thoughts of other thinkers like George Ellis and Van Hatteren, who've explained strong emergence, and I'm using all of their insights. In fact, I need to reference them later. But the question then becomes, can you actually prove this? Okay, so I've just been giving you reasons, right? I've just been giving you reasons to think why. I mean, hopefully they've been convincing. Please let me know why higher level systems are causally effective on lower level domains, and why strong emergence must be real. So I've been giving you plenty of reasons, but then the question becomes, can we actually prove this? Like, prove it in a mathematical sense, such that it's not possible to deny that this is a thing. Because so yeah, whether a phenomenon is weakly or strongly emergent is extremely difficult to prove with certainty. I read one author who had a very good point in favor of strong emergence, which is that, like, if you believe that a phenomenon is weakly emergent, like, you should try to prove it, right? Like, it's possible to prove that a phenomenon is weakly emergent, and then once you prove it, you'll know for sure that it's weakly emergent. It's not you can't really question it, because if you can show, this is very simple, if you can show just using the lower level laws a higher level phenomenon is implied by those lower level laws, you've proved that the phenomenon is weakly emergent. Okay, but it's actually very difficult to do this because, again, we need a lot of computing power. Even the complicated dynamics within a proton are so complicated that we need very sophisticated computers in order to run the calculations. And we're still not even that close to getting a result there. And so we can't it's very hard to show that a proton is weakly emergent. But we should start with this author asserts that we should start with the assumption that a phenomenon is strongly emergent and then falsify this. So this is falsifiable. And then you can proceed and attempt to prove this hypothesis wrong. And every time you fail to do so, that's evidence that the phenomenon could be strongly emergent. But is there another way to prove it? Is there a way to prove it such that you can't even deny that this phenomenon is strongly emergent? And the answer is yes, and we have. We've shown mathematically, or at least George Ellis has shown mathematically, that there are some processes in the universe that how do I put this? Like that can alter the way particles at the lower level behave. Okay, and the way he did this is to study a system which we understand very closely. Okay, so the difficulty with studying something like consciousness is that we didn't design consciousness, right? Evolution designed consciousness for us, and then we use our consciousness to understand the universe. But it's really hard to study our own consciousness and come up with a model and then show that consciousness arises from this lower level model. So the difficulty of doing this in the natural world is very clear. But what about using a system that we invented where we understand all of the mechanics properly? And a good example of this would be computer transistors. Okay, so we've invented transistors, and your computer or device that you're watching this on right now has billions of them, and that's what allows your computer to behave as a computer. And transistors involve the flow of electrons and electric current, and we understand how electric current works at the lowest levels. And so this will give us a way to examine whether the transistors themselves, something about the transistors themselves, is influencing the way the particles at the lowest level behave. Now, the argument that's being made is that you can arrange computer transistors to give you logical statements. Okay, so and or not XOR, these are logical operations which you can make out of circuits. So you take circuits and then you make logic out of them. And then the question is this logic real? Because the logic is kind of language, right? It's a kind of linguistic statement, and then you just use electrons to answer questions about these linguistic statements. That's one way to think about it. So does that language, does that logic influence the way electrons behave? And the answer appears to be yes. The way electrons behave in a transistor, or sorry, not in a transistor, but in when it goes through a logic gate, or when it goes through a whole series of logic gates, digital logic, the logic itself is influencing the way electrons behave. So it's not just the lower level electron dynamics, it's the logic. Where does logic exist? Think about it. Does logic, you can represent logic using transistors, that's sure. So in that sense, the logic is physical, but the logic itself appears to be something that goes beyond the physical world. It's a lot, logic is more abstract, right? It's not even something that our minds are necessarily engaged in. It's some way of imposing conditions upon the way the physical world behaves, because of the way we've arranged these circuits to tell us logical statements. So this is an example of top-down effects, which implies that it can't be predicted solely from the lower level laws. Okay? So the way we want to examine this is to start from the lowest level that we can, and we're very lucky here because it's just electrons moving through wires, right? And so the Hamiltonian. So this is just an equation which tells us exactly how we can expect electrons to move, individual electrons and ions to move, and these are the lowest level laws. Okay, so we can start here. This will be our starting point, and then we can keep going up levels to see what goes on at these higher levels. Okay, so the next level that we have is the way electrons move through a wire And there's some things you can think about here. For example, like the fact that electrons are moving in this way is kind of unnatural, right? Like it obviously follows natural laws, but we're the ones who created a wire and purified it so that the metal in the wire can conduct electricity. Okay, but arguably this is still just following the laws of electrons at that lower level. So we don't really have anything special going on here, but it is interesting and something is emerging. Like there is new behavior going on here, which is resulting from a lot of electrons. Okay. So then we have this, the next level, the crystal structure. Okay, so now we have a different type of conducting material called the semiconductor. And we have different types of semiconductors, N-type and P-type. And these are resultant from the silicon crystals that we use. So we use silicon as a semiconductor because it has this property of being able to conduct electricity whenever we want it to. And it's very simple. We just create an electric field near the, you'll see this in the next slide. We create an electric field, and this allows electron to flow. So we have this switch, okay, and this crystal structure is causing the electrons to behave differently, right? Like the structure itself is creating this new dynamic by which the electrons are exposed to, it allows us, using logical statements, to manipulate the flow of electrons, okay? So you have here a transistor, and the idea behind a transistor is, again, you have this gate contact, which through which you conduct electricity. And then when you conduct electricity using this gate contact, so you turn the gate on, now electricity can flow through the semiconductor. So normally there's this depletion layer which prevents current from flowing. But if you add an electric field near the p-doped semiconductor, this allows electrons to jump the depletion range. It shrinks the depletion range so that electrons can conduct across the wire. Okay, so you have this thing that can conduct or not conduct electricity depending on whether there's an electric field there. And that electric field is this new thing which you need to add into your electron equation in order to get the behavior of the electron. Then you can take these transistors and arrange them in very specific ways such that you get logical statements out of them. Okay, so for example, if you want to get a NOT gate, what you do is you put the gate contact somewhere else, like somewhere different down the conducting material, and then when it's on, so basically electricity will always be flowing through it, but when the gate is on, electricity won't be flowing through it. So you get the opposite of what you inputted. Let's do an example of the OR gate. You basically just take two of these and then connect them in parallel. And then when you connect them in parallel, regardless of whether the top one is on or the bottom one is on, the electricity will flow. It'll only not flow if you have both of them off. And then an AND gate is simpler. You just take two of these and connect them in series. So the only way it'll be on is if both are on. Okay, so you're getting logical statements, these logical statements out of circuits. So you're putting these circuits together and then designing them such that electricity and electrons are being forced to do math. Okay, and then I want to go one more level higher, just because I like this level, is that when you take these different transistors, these different logic gates, and put them in very specific combinations, and then you get digital logic out of it. So you can answer even more complicated questions just using electricity. You can do simple math, not even simple math, you can do extremely complicated math, and force electrons to obey like just mathematical statements that you impose upon them. So you arrange the transistors and the logic gates in such a way that the electrons can only move through those gates in a very particular way, which is dictated by the logic. So then the question we ask is, can I use level 1, so these electron dynamics, and then solve the equations for this system and then get the right answer? And the answer is no. The abstract logic that you've created by designing the transistors in a specific way is influencing the electron dynamics. It's causing, it involves the logical statements introducing electric fields and then influencing the crystal structure. But overall, it chains all the way back down. The logic chains all the way back down these levels until it influences the electrons and ions. And then at this level, if you want to correctly predict things, you need to add in a new term in the equation. So you take that original equation that you have here, and then you have to alter it to account for the things that are happening at the logical level, which then chain down to things happening at the various levels until you reach that very bottom level. Okay, so like so for example, if I go here quickly, I want to show this level 4 again because it's arguably where most of this stuff is happening. When it says V greater than V threshold, that means that the electric field at that gate is high, which allows the conducting channel to conduct electricity. So basically, this is saying that something which occurs in a general sense, which is dictated by things at a higher sense, is causing this behavior to change at the lower level. Okay, so that means that this original equation that we had, which tells us how the electrons are supposed to move, it needs to be changed. You need to rewrite this equation. Okay, so when you rewrite this equation, which again accounts for the logical statements that are going on, you can get the right answers. But the answers that you're getting are that electrons are somehow doing math. Like you've imposed logic upon electrons, and now the electrons are doing math. Like they don't just do math on their own, you know. Like they're giving you answers to mathematical problems which you specified through the circuit structure. Okay, so the structure of the logical arguments is influencing how the electrons move. And now, because of a downward chain of causation from these abstract entities to the crystal structure and then to the electron structure, the electron dynamics, which normally take place at the lowest level, no longer apply. And so you need an altered version. And the thing is, and you might be thinking like, okay, that's still materialistic, right? Because I can still use that altered version of the equation to predict how the electrons will flow. I'll get that they're doing mathematical statements, but nevertheless, I can still use that equation, right? Well, the problem is that where did this alteration of the equation come from? What was the source, right? The source was the abstract logic. So logic itself must be having a downward causal influence on fundamental physics. If I don't take the logic into account, I won't be able to find this new equation, which will tell me how the circuit or how the electrons will move. And so you have a higher level thing very clearly, very easily shown. This is very easily shown that's causing the lower level dynamics to change. So transistors are strongly emergent. They're this new technology that we've created that is changing the way electrons behave at a lower level, and it's allowing us to use electrons to do math, which I think is incredible and like clearly very a good example of downward causation, because electrons don't just they don't just sum up numbers. They don't add 1 + 1 by themselves, but you can make them do that through this very complicated system that we've designed. And again, this is the level where a lot of that happens. A lot of the complicated dynamics that introduce new terms into the equation. So that original Hamiltonian, again, a Hamiltonian is just the equation that relates things like energy to how the system will move through space and time. And you need to add a new term to that equation, and so it's altered. And this is mathematical proof that strong emergence is real. And you can expect other phenomena to also alter fundamental physics in other ways. And again, the thing is, like, I'm even the complexity of this lecture is masking what's really even more complex dynamics, because these levels themselves, it's not just level 5 or level 6 influencing level 1. Like level 2 might influence level 1, and level 1 is influencing level 2. And then level 2 might influence level 3, but then there's also dynamics at level 1 that may influence level 3, and then it goes back down. So there are multiple levels of causation, and then multiple ways in which these levels are linked to each other. You can have something at a very low level having a very slight minor influence on something at a very high level, and then something at a very high level having like a minor influence on something, but not maybe not on the lowest level, but somewhere in between. Okay, and then those higher levels can themselves be combined in various ways to emergently give rise to even more highly emergent phenomena. So this whole thing is completely crazy, and that's why I find it fascinating. This is mind-bogglingly insane, just how it really. the conclusion that you should really draw from all of this is just like reality is so perplexingly complex. It doesn't mean that we should just like give up on our attempts to understand reality, but we should open our minds to how strange the world really is and just how many different types of phenomena can exist, and like stop trying to reduce everything to one thing, because it's just not the way reality is structured. It's weird. It's a weird place. And different fields of study are legitimate. Like philosophy is a legitimate field of science or of inquiry. Psychology is a legitimate field of science, because some people would say that psychology isn't a real science because it's studying things that don't exist, because your imagination and your mental life doesn't really exist. What this is saying is that it definitely exists, and you should study psychology because these higher level phenomena can interact with each other in such a way that you get a consistent theory, and that theory is, useful or like possible to validate scientifically. A good example would be like Jungian archetypes. Like, in what sense do Jungian archetypes exist? Like, they clearly emerge from very complicated processes happening in your brain and happening in your nervous system. And yet, I can write a theory about how these things interact, and that theory will give me strong predictions about human behavior. And so, I'm not using matter to explain human behavior. I'm using things that arise from that matter, which themselves form a specific theory at a certain level. But then again, this is not to say you should ignore the material level, although in some cases you pretty much should. The material level is still relevant. It's just it's just not the final cause, let's say. It's not the final cause in the whole system. Now, the thing I want to talk about is something called multiple realizability, which is, so the whole transistor thing influencing the way electrons work. It might give you the impression that, like for example, that the transistors themselves have a physical structure. The wires, the way they're wired is physical, and everything that happens inside is physical. So really everything happening there is physical. Why would you claim that there is strong emergence? Now, here's a kind of different argument, is that you can actually make transistors from other components. You don't have to use electricity. So this is an example of a computer made with water. Okay, so it's designed by hand to carry out logical operations, the same logical operations we saw with the transistors. And it's capable of doing the exact same math. Okay, so in this case, we're causing water to behave slightly differently. The reason the water is behaving slightly differently, again, is because of the structure of these individual boxes. These boxes they're designed such that they carry out the operations of and, or, not, and so that in and of itself is influencing the way the water is flowing through this system. And you could probably even check, like using fluid dynamics, whether fluid dynamics will account for what's going on here. But regardless, this is something called multiple realizability. It's the fact that so logic and carrying out math using Boolean algebra is something that can be realized using multiple different systems. Okay, so you don't need electrons to be able to do Boolean algebra. That's just the way that we do it in our computers, because it's really powerful. But you can use other things to come up with. You can use Lego, for example, and you'll get the same kind of behavior. Okay, so the whole point is that you're getting the same phenomenon using a completely different system. And the phenomenon is doing math using logical operators, and then using Boolean algebra to get the results of those mathematical operations. So you can do that in multiple different ways. And the point is that this new behavior, which whatever you're using is engaging in, so doing math, again, it's not accountable just by the dynamics of those lower level laws. It involves these other things called logical operators, and so you can see here that this is a clear case of downward emergence. And then you can even think of you can even keep going, because again, digital logic is just one lower level phenomenon within a computer, but then you can keep going up, and there's these levels of abstraction. So you can take digital logic and then create microarchitecture, and then this will you can arrange the different types of microarchitecture like ALUs and memory to get a CPU architecture, and then you can communicate with that via machine code, assembly language, compilers, and then eventually you get to higher level code. Okay, so this is the code that you write out on your computer in whatever language you want, Python, C++, Java. This code is a language, an abstract language, which you can feed into your computer, and then through this chain of causation, from the compilers to the interpreters, all the way down to the transistors, and then all the way down to the electrons, your higher level code, which you wrote in a language, is changing the way electrons behave. So you created this entirely abstract thing, and that abstract thing is giving rise to the way electrons behave at a lower level. So you're changing the way they behave. You're forcing them to do something which they don't ordinarily do of their own dynamics, but they will do when a higher level dynamic is imposed upon them. So you're writing code, literally writing abstract ideas on a language, and then that's causing electrons to behave differently. This is clearly an example of strong emergence because like abstract logic doesn't just exist in the universe, you know? Like it's something that our minds came up with and then understand, and then we impose it upon transistors to get our transistors to do these crazy things. And like, and again, what's happening at the lowest level, and there's complicated dynamics going on here. So it's not just that the higher level is causing the lower level, because the lower level is kind of like what you're trying to interact with. So you interact with electrons flowing through gates, and then that gives you a program. So whatever program you ran with your code, it'll result in this output. So the transistors do this work, and then the whole thing chains back up. So you can imagine each of these arrows, just like imagine the reverse arrow going back up. The transistors then cause this chain going back up to give you the results of your program, okay? And then that can enter a new chain of causation, because if you have a program that takes as input whatever you output it, which is basically any program you write will be probably be of that nature. The output gets fed back in, it goes back down, and then you get an input back up. So you have downward causation and upward causation, and these are linked to each other and causing each other simultaneously, or not even simultaneously. There's a time-dependent relationship, but regardless, there's temporal asymmetry. So the downward causation has to be taken into account. Now, I probably I have 6 viewers, and you guys are probably all confused about what I'm doing. I'll continue explaining as if everybody heard all of the lecture, because you can now there's a kind of different argument in favor of strong emergence, which I want to explore briefly. This topic should be a whole bunch of different slides, but it does get into a few discussions that will illuminate different aspects of strong emergence, and then like the different characteristics of it. So we can create a completely different argument for the existence of strong emergence. What if, because again, this is all about computational dynamics, and I've explained the computational dynamics from the perspective of like the physical transistors. But what if we use a very simple simulation to demonstrate the existence of emergence? Okay, so what we have here is Conway's game of life. If you're not familiar with Conway's game of life, look into it. It's a very fascinating topic in mathematics and computer science, and it's still the topic of significant research, despite being so simple. So it's basically just a computer program, a computer game that plays itself. And it involves a bunch of cells on a grid. And where you see white cells in this picture, those are called living cells, so they're alive. And whether a cell lives or dies in the next generation is determined by the cells around it. And you can come up with a few different rules, but the rules are very simple. I should probably check what the rules are. 1 second, let me edit the slideshow just to include a note. Here. I'll do that. Okay, so there are very simple rules which govern the way the way cells can be either live or dead. So something like if a cell has like no neighbors, it dies. If a cell has like exactly 2 neighbors, it comes to life. And if a cell has like more than 3 or something, it dies. Sorry, my dog is barking. Teddy, hey! He likes to bark at strangers, and he also does not like to listen. Hey! Stop it. Okay. Yikes. The second hey! Okay. Sorry for the interruption. Oh man, he is really bad. He is really disobedient. Okay. So the simple laws in Conway's Game of Life can be thought of as just a bunch of like a very simple math, right? Like you can like if you know the math which governs the way new cells will either come alive or come dead. You know, it's very simple, and so you can use the math to predict what's going to happen in the next generation. You look at all of the different cells, and then you can tell which ones are going to come to life and which ones are going to die. Okay, 1 second. Stop it. Okay. Keeps throwing me off my focus. Okay. So you should be able to predict everything that's going to happen within Conway's Game of Life using this very simple math. Now, what's important to note is that this math is actually like way simpler than like the math that governs particles. I don't know if you've ever seen the math that governs particles. I mean, I showed it earlier. Like this would be an example. This Hamiltonian down here. And then the standard model Lagrangian. Like it's all very, very complicated. Okay. And so the argument here is that if you could create a strongly emergent phenomenon from even simpler mathematics than the dynamics of particles, what you should see, what you're basically showing is that if a strongly emergent phenomenon can arise in this context, the odds of it existing in the real world are just very, very, very high. Because if you can get it to occur in a very simple mathematical arrangement, a very complicated mathematical arrangement will almost certainly give you strongly emergent phenomena. In the Game of Life, it's really fascinating, and you should watch videos of like the different things that people can create, because you can get all sorts of different behaviors to emerge. These are examples of some structures that you can get within the Game of Life. You can even get structures that replicate themselves. You can get structures that keep growing and growing. So you get this very complicated behavior from these very simple rules. So it's very fascinating. And then what researchers have done is that they've asked the question of whether strong emergence can occur within these systems. So if everything that happens within the Game of Life is weakly emergent, okay, you can use the simple rules of the game to predict what's going to happen next, okay? And then you can just keep doing this, and every single different kind of structure that you see within the Game of Life, you can tell what's going to happen to it. Either it's going to eventually die or just keep growing, and you can just use the very simple math, apply it to all of these cells, and that'll tell you what's going to go on. Okay? What several researchers have done is that they've shown independently that you can create a strongly emergent phenomenon within this simulation. Okay, again, this is a very simple computer simulation involving just cells on a grid, and yet you can use the math to create structures which then influence the bigger structures, the holistic structures, then influence the way the phenomenon behaves overall. Okay, so these lower level laws that you have, which are very simple, are no longer telling you how the system will evolve. You need to now look at a holistic system, the kind of like these bigger structures that you see. You can't look at the individual parts. You have to look at the bigger structures that you see, and then use these structures to determine what's going to happen next. So you need to take into account the higher level structures. Okay. And that's rather incredible, okay? Because it literally, you can create something within a simulation that breaks the rules of the simulation. Like, and that should be completely fascinating. And it's not that it necessarily breaks the rules of the simulation. It just alters them, modifies them, such that they are insufficient for giving you the correct answers. So that's all that's meant by that. So the reason why this is important is because if you can create a strongly emergent phenomenon in a really simple system like the Game of Life, the odds of it existing in real life are extremely high. Now, again, if you're like me and you observe life a lot, you realize that this is completely obvious. Like if you look at any living thing that possesses consciousness, it's very clear that consciousness is strongly emergent, that most living organisms are strongly emergent, that they do things which cannot be accounted for in terms of particle physics. And so life clearly does give rise to strongly emergent phenomena, but not even just life. Simple computer simulations can give rise to strongly emergent phenomena. Okay, so let's see what we have next. Yeah, so I wanted to hammer home some more points about strong emergence. These different domains you should think of as like a field of knowledge. If you wanna talk about like the ability to understand these phenomena at the levels at which they exist, we should consider each field existing at its own level and according to its own laws at that level. Okay, so with economics, it doesn't make sense to try to explain economics from the motion of matter, because economics involves things which are non-material. Value, for instance, the value that we have for money is something that exists in our heads. Okay, so if you want to do economics, you have to do economics involving all of the higher level laws that exist at that domain, all of the concepts that exist, supply, demand, goods, whatever economics. I'm not somebody who's into economics so much, but all the concepts that exist in economics, they have to exist at their own field, at their own level, and that's how you do economics. Now, you can bring in information from lower level domains, and that might tell you something. That might give you some information, but it's not the whole picture. And arguably, it's kind of inefficient to go to those levels. It really depends. Like in psychology, it makes sense to talk about brain neurons, for example. That's a lower level in psychology because brain neurons give rise to psychological processes, but those psychological processes are like the subject of study in psychology. But it does make sense to go to the brain and look at the brain because that's involved very clearly between the relationship between mind and matter. So your brain is an important thing to look at, even though it's a lower level domain relative to your psyche, to your experience, to your consciousness. But then you don't, for example, if you're doing psychology, you don't want to go down to the level of particle physics because that's just an irrelevant level. Like even the activity of neurons, it doesn't really make sense to talk about that from the perspective of particle physics. You're going way too far down. And arguably, that's when it becomes irrelevant. Although it is relevant, I'm not saying it's entirely irrelevant. It's relevant because it creates the conditions for these higher level phenomena to exist. But the way that phenomena can stack on each other means that it just becomes so pointless to just look at the lower level particles. And again, this is arguably why the universe is so complex and why there are so many different fields of science and different fields of study. And I always think of it in terms of a field of study because this means like it's a new area that our minds can approach. But arguably, even before there were fields of science, there were phenomena that existed at these higher levels, like societies, cities that are composed of many different people. And then things that humans engage in, like creativity, that involves mental abstractions, right? Like if you create something with your mind, you've used neurons in your mind to create some abstract entity, and then you can alter the universe such that this abstract entity starts to exist. So like abstractions and things that exist, which aren't physical in their inherent nature, although they are facilitated by physics, are influencing the reality. And so it should be said that they exist and that they're strongly emergent. But then we don't really know what the limits of this are because as we progress in our technological sophistication, we are observing ever more strongly emergent phenomena. Things like the internet. A computer is strongly emergent, but then you get a whole bunch of computers and connect them through these networks. And then you have the internet, which is a crazy next level strongly emergent phenomenon. But then you have things like AI, which are even more and more strongly emergent. And these are all technological, keep in mind. And so we don't really know what the limits are here. And then eventually it's possible that we can get to phenomena that we think are currently impossible. And in fact, that's generally how emergence, tackles the universe. Emergence gives rise to things that can conquer the universe, so to speak. Like being able to fly is like physically very difficult, but then emergence gives rise to things that can fly, like birds. So birds are kind of resisting the way the predisposition of the universe. And we don't know what the limits are here. We don't know how strongly emergent phenomena can get. And there's good reason to think that like there are no limits. And like you can even like Like you can even find domains of existence that are completely parallel to other domains, um, and like something like a religion, for example. Like does a religion exist in the real world? Like it's clearly this metaphysical thing that humans engage in, and yet it's having causal efficacy. But it's hard to classify, like what kind of a phenomenon is that? Is it a biological phenomenon? Is it sociological? I guess it's sociological, but then it's also like metaphysical and like spiritual. So it involves a domain that's so parallel to like other domains of physical phenomena. And so it's possible that different levels of phenomena will be completely different from each other. And I've already talked about the idea of multiple realizability a few times. It's basically the fact, I want to just reiterate one more thing. It's the fact that higher level phenomena, they can be realized in a variety of different ways. So for example, you can use electric circuits to create transistors, or you can use water to create transistors, and then the phenomenon in which they're engaged in, Boolean algebra, is realized in different mechanisms. Similarly, something like life, something like living or biology, it's possible that in the universe, that phenomenon can be realized using different means. So instead of using DNA, they use a different molecule, or instead of being carbon-based, they're silicon-based. And so it's possible to get something like life that follows all of the rules of life, but which itself is different at the lower levels. And so higher level domains can be realized in a few different ways, which proves even further that they must exist apart from the matter that comprises them. Even though they're reliant on the matter for their existence, there's attributes of their nature which are not reducible to those physics because they can be realized in different ways. Okay, and this is the page where I have my references, which I need to put, and yeah, that's the end of this slideshow. Any questions? Okay, let's see what we got. Right, me too. I had a very difficult time picturing them. That was in response to chair dogs. I know, what the hell does a chair dog even look like? Also, why would you breed such a thing into existence? You know that we will too. Like humans we just create everything we can because we can. A non-existence theorem for a proof against strong emergence sounds feasible. Maybe fruits of assembly theory in 10, 20 years. In the absence of a proof, it hopefully could yield a probabilistic stand-in. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that sounds like an even more complicated proof, which maybe deals with some of the issues which philosophers still highlight about the concept of strong emergence. One issue is that it seems that strong emergence implies that it's possible to break the laws of physics, and people treat the laws of physics like they shall not be broken, and if you imply that they could be broken, you're speaking blasphemy, which is a very interesting development. That the laws of physics themselves have been taken to be immutable. But there's good reason to think that they're immutable. But it's not that they're not. It's not that we can break the laws of physics. It's just that we can modify them slightly because of new phenomena. So new phenomena can just cause the laws of physics to be slightly different. It's not breaking the laws of physics. But also I think physicists should be used to the idea of something breaking the laws of physics, because arguably, if gravity is strongly emergent, which I think it is, and there's good reason to think that it is, it's a very different kind of strongly emergent phenomena, but it is strongly emergent. And it's clear that this is incompatible with quantum mechanics. Okay, but why is it incompatible? Is it incompatible because there's a deeper law that we need to figure out? Or is it incompatible because gravity, frankly, just breaks the laws of physics? Gravity breaks the laws of physics at the lowest scale, but that's totally fine because it operates on a different scale. Gravity doesn't have to be quantum because it operates in a way where quantum mechanics is basically irrelevant. So it's possible for gravity and quantum mechanics to exist, but then there's no need for these laws to be compatible with each other because they exist at different domains of existence, at different scales, at different levels. And that's by far the simplest and most harmonious explanation for why quantum mechanics is incompatible with gravity, with general relativity. Look into symplectic geometry. It's the field of math that basically underlies all Hamiltonian. Ooh, interesting. Okay, that'll give me more information. All Hamiltonian systems. There's a theorem called the non-squeezing theorem that is equivalent to the uncertainty principle. That's really good to know. Okay, I'll look into that. I mean, I'm wondering, how much of the Hamiltonian mechanics do I need to know? Because I was hoping to like make this lecture pretty accessible, and I was hoping it's been accessible. But of course, I've realized that there are some issues with my lecture that I need to work out. But that's why I'm practicing. But I'm wondering like how much of the Hamiltonian mechanics here are necessary to know in order to get the general picture across. Because I was just going to say like, yeah, look at this electron equation, and then can you tell what's going to happen here because of that within this digital logic? And like I was just going to say like, yeah, no, because the digital logic itself is influencing this equation, and in this equation you need to modify it, and like hopefully that's like enough for people to get I mean, people are smart, like they can get the point across. I think they can understand the point as long as I explain it properly. Is there a highest level, or does the process of realms arising out of realms keep building forever? That's an amazing question. I'm glad you asked that. I don't know if there's a highest level, and like this is one of the things about this is that it's raising more questions, and this is a really good one that are just really difficult to answer. Like, does it just keep going and going and going infinitely? It feels like it kind of does. Like I don't know what the limits are. I don't know where you get to like the absolute highest structure. Turtles all the way up. I don't know. It's and it makes me like question whether like the idea of God even makes sense. Because like what are the limits on God? Like if God is supposed to be like the highest of all beings, but then you can just keep getting higher and higher beings, like it's just brain perplexing. And so I don't know if there's a highest of all levels. My feeling is that there's not really a highest level, or that we shouldn't conclude that there is, and that this can just keep going and going and going forever. I mean, maybe at some point it stops because of like feasibility, like the universe just runs out of space or something like that. But as far as I could tell, it just keeps going. And like, for example, like one of the questions I was pondering was like, is color, so color I would say is strongly emergent. Even if you think color exists in the objective universe, firstly, it only exists from collections of particles. So like a green object, like if I looked at all the particles, I'll never find green in the particles, but the collection of particles is green. So that means it's emergent. But then there's also the fact that color exists as a psychological phenomenon and experience. And it's not clear whether the color that I see corresponds to the like objective color of the universe. So in that sense, it's probably also strongly emergent. And then I asked the question, well, if color is strongly emergent, is there a limit on the number of colors I can see? Like, because I could just keep building upon different kind of photoreceptors and keep designing new photoreceptors to be slightly different, and then maybe this will keep resulting in new colors. And again, you can't predict what the color is going to be from the physics because nobody's able to do that. But could you just keep making new colors? And does it ever end? And like, I don't know. Like maybe it does, but maybe it doesn't. I don't know. We're getting to a point where we have to push this further to see what the conclusions are, because there are genuinely good questions that don't have answers yet. True. Well, no need to delve into obscure mathematics. Yeah, I mean, I hope just by like showing the math, I'm making people feel smart, because it's not that hard to even I don't understand the Hamiltonian for the electron, because it's just look at this insanity. All I know is that this is what you need to use to calculate the motion of electrons normally, and then what I can show is that this equation fails in this context, in this level 6 context, because of a new thing called logic. Logic itself is abstract, and it's influencing electron mechanics, forcing them to do math, which is not something they normally do. Okay, and does the feedbacks keep cycling from the highest level all the way down to the lowest foundation? Can the foundation itself, the fundamental structure of matter itself, also be altered? So to answer your second question first, yes, it can be altered. Altered though, like it shouldn't. So far, the alterations don't appear to be super dramatic. You know, like it's like the laws are still applicable. It's just that you're getting these complicated dynamics as a result of like our technology and of like our ingenuity. We're using like the properties of silicon. So if you go here, you're using the properties of silicon, and it's not just silicon, right? I hope people are familiar enough with transistors because, I mean, try to be familiar with transistors because they power the modern world. But what's going on here is that you have this crystal of silicon, and then you've added some elements into it. You've added phosphorus, I think, in the p doped. Oh no, you probably added phosphorus in the p doped, and you've added something in the n doped. So it's sorry, in the p doped. So what was I saying? So this particular crystal structure, it's introducing these more complicated dynamics, this more like interesting setup because of the way we've designed it and because of the properties of different atoms and different conducting materials as a whole. So as a whole, this semiconductor can conduct electricity. That's a higher level thing right there, but then the structure of that crystal is kind of like altering these dynamics. And then when you find out what's causing these altered dynamics, you see that it's an electric field caused by the metal gate, caused by the contact gate. And this electric field is now going to be a part of the equation, which tells you how the electrons move. And then if you keep digging and you keep looking, you see that it's actually the overall structure of the logic gates, which then is through this downward effect influencing the electron movement. And so again, the electron movement is unpredictable from just this equation itself. You have to take this equation, add the concept of logic, which doesn't exist at a lower level. So you've added a higher level concept, and there you go. You can calculate what's going to happen. So yeah, a lot going on. There's more to talk about. There's like a lot more to talk about. But hopefully, like the things that I find interesting are DNA. Like really, this DNA is strongly emergent, even though it has a physical structure. It involves so many things that make it strongly emergent. That's what's fascinating about it, is that on the one hand, its evolution is stochastic. There's randomness involved because random mutations. On the other hand, it's encoding information about an environment and information about a living organism in that environment. So it itself is being influenced by a top-down effect environment, but it's influencing a bottom-up effect, an organism that results from this DNA. And like I've repeated this several times, but I'll repeat it again. The thing that kind of really sets DNA apart as a strongly emergent phenomena is the fact that it encodes information about a living organism, so about the structure of a living organism. And so that encoding process is something which matter in and of itself doesn't ordinarily do. This is something new. This is encoding. It's encoding information. And the thing about that information is that the information can be shown to be the thing that survives. Okay, so genes try to maintain their structure, right? Like you know about the idea of the selfish gene, that like a gene or like a DNA, its whole purpose is to survive and maintain its structure and evolve such that the evolution of new traits that the DNA expresses are perpetuated, so it survives in the long term. Okay, now. What survives, very fascinatingly, is not the molecule itself. So like if I think about a cell, like say a sperm cell and an egg cell, they each contribute a set of DNA to that organism, okay? And then that DNA survives through time, okay? But it's not the specific molecules of that DNA. So if you have a sperm cell and an egg cell, they have a bunch of matter that's expressed in the form of DNA. But when that person goes on to pass on their genes to somebody else, it's not those specific molecules that survives. It's the information encoded in the molecules, because that information can be encoded in a different set of molecules. You can get the exact same coding or information from a different set of molecules. Okay, so it's not the molecules themselves that are surviving, it's the information contained therein. So this means that there's something above and beyond the molecules in DNA. There's information. There's a different kind of information and a different kind of a coding which exists in a realm beyond just the molecule. So it's very different. It's a very different type of molecule, and we can explain it as a physical structure, and that's a perfectly valid picture of what DNA is, but it's doing something that's completely different from how matter ordinarily behaves. And so and another way to put this is like, imagine you had two identical sets of the exact same DNA. Okay, they're identical. They're different. They're different though because they're made of different particles, and yet they both give rise to the same organism. If you have like a twin, for example, or a clone which has the exact same set of DNA in its structure and its cells will give rise to the exact same organism. Okay, but what the key thing you have to realize here is that you have different matter that comprises the one animal's DNA and different matter which comprises the other animal's DNA. So completely different matter, and yet the information they're expressing is exactly the same. So the information has to exist in a level above the matter. Okay. Okay, so let's see what else. Basically, there's infinitely many levels of infinity. Integer infinity cannot be reached. The infinity of continuum being the first and only pseudo-conceivable example. Very loose reasoning, gut instinct. No. Okay, hold on. You might actually be very right. Although I think you wrote something about that. I believe the levels of emergence are not fundamentally limited. Inaccessible cardinals, discrete infinity, continuum infinity. Well, infinity. Yeah. Yeah. So no. I think. Okay. Here we're getting really deep now. So I think you're onto something. And here's the reason why. Is because I think I've found a connection between computational incompleteness and strong emergence, which I'm trying to explore, but I don't know if it's right yet. And I don't know if it makes sense. But basically, there's another way to express strong emergence, which is a strongly emergent phenomenon. Is a phenomenon where a new unprovably true statement applies in that situation. Okay, so it's like there's in any mathematical system, any strong mathematical system is incomplete. There are true statements in that system that cannot be proven in terms of that system. Okay, now the reason why that could give rise to strong emergence is because you can't predict that new truth, that new, I'll call it an axiom, from the mathematics because it's unprovable. And yet, in a given context, it might be true for that context. Okay? So, and then the question is, what is the nature of these unprovably true statements? Yeah, exactly, Gödel. Yeah. The nature of them is that there appears to be infinitely more unprovable, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are infinitely more. There's the infinity, which captures the number of unprovably true statements, is greater than the number of provably true statements. Something like that, right? So that infinity is larger. And if that infinity is larger, and that is the phenomenon which results in strong emergence, we should expect there to be more strongly emergent phenomena than weakly emergent phenomena. Weak emergence is the exception. And if weak emergence is the exception, we should really be mind blown at examples of weak emergence, because strong emergence, it just means that strong emergence just happens to be the ultimate nature. But yeah, I think you're definitely onto something. I'll explore that more in my thinking, but it's not really my field, to be honest. I'm not really a math guy. Although I do find it very fascinating. I find the philosophy of math very interesting, and obviously you need to know about the philosophy of math to examine something like this. But I only know it at a very surface level. But yeah. It's possible, yeah, it would be kind of brain breaking to contemplate that there are more strongly emergent phenomena, like possible strongly emergent phenomena, because the thing is, there could be a lot of strongly emergent phenomena that just haven't emerged, like for example, if I take, let's go back to my periodic table and find a fun example. If I take, where in the periodic table, do I have one? I must have one, yeah. Okay. If I take, like, for example, this uranium with this gold, with this cadmium, with this xenon, and just put it together in some arbitrary way, it's possible I can get some phenomenon that's strongly emergent. It might not be useful, but it's possible that, like, I'll get a thing that, like, if I try. So here's how we show if it's strongly emergent. First, I can imagine that particle, right? Like, I can imagine me making some arbitrary thing, like some arbitrary combination of elements that has never existed in this universe. I'll just take them and I'll put them together, okay? And then I'll try to predict the properties of that phenomenon just from the math. So just from the what I know about how each of these particles behaves, I should be able to predict what's going to happen. And then if I actually do it, and then if I observe phenomenon that I didn't predict, then that's an example of strong emergence. And it's possible that, like, that like you can't have predicted them because there's just something that you weren't accounting for, or because when the particles are arranged in a specific way, something happens that changes their nature ever so slightly, giving rise to strongly emergent phenomena. So like strongly emergent phenomena could be the norm. In physics, though, like people are under the impression that everything is weakly emergent, which makes sense, but also doesn't make sense. Like it makes sense because it's easier to understand and because like it's easier to scale up, but it also doesn't make sense because nobody has shown that like very specific phenomena are actually of that nature. You can do it with like very small scale phenomena, and that convinces physicists that like, oh, like everything must be of this nature, but it's not everything. Like the fact that we can do it with some things is a miracle and very fascinating, but it's just not feasible for all things. Like the space of conceivable evolutionary path. Yeah, versus the universal historical. Exactly. We don't know which path of strongly emergent phenomena we've traced. But I would say we've traced a very interesting one for the main reason that that biology exists on this universe, like on this planet. That biology exists on this planet shows us that we're in a very interesting array of strongly emergent phenomenon, but we don't know what the entire like spectrum of strongly emergent phenomena could look like. We're just in one kind of like, because obviously the life that exists all is connected through DNA. So DNA was so strongly emergent, like it was so next level, that it gave rise to all of this craziness that we see around us. Just like trees, like nobody's sufficiently mind blown enough by trees. Like just go to a forest and look up. And just look at these things, these towering structures reaching towards the heavens, and and just realize that that's bizarre beyond comprehension. We take it as normal because we live on the planet, and so we see trees all the time, and there's nothing interesting about a tree because we're used to it. But if you could just bleed reality of everything you were used to, you would see it and be like mind blown beyond belief that any of this was possible. Which is why I promote psychedelics, because it puts you in that state of mind, and which is the state of mind that I think people can really start to appreciate the world around them and how miraculous it is. Okay, so I've been lecturing for like 2 hours. I have a good sense of where I want to take this lecture, I hope. I have a lot of work to do, including adding the references here so that people who think I'm plagiarizing are satisfied. But yeah, thank you for watching. If you guys have any more questions, just ask them now or forever hold your peace. But I hope you found that interesting. I find it interesting, obviously, because I spent this much time talking about it. Although I'm not finding it as interesting as some of the other stuff I talk about. So maybe this lecture won't be turned into a video, but we'll see. I hope to make it a video. But yeah, no more questions? All right. Thank you so much for watching, and hope you have a good day. Oh, got a question. Is the destiny of the tree already present in the acorn? Teleology. There, yeah, that's a very good point. Teleology is very, because what is teleology? Like teleology itself must be emergent. Like things don't have an inherent teleology, but like a human does. Like a human's goal is to survive, or like we also create our own goals. And so we're goal-oriented beings, and so we have a specific teleology. Is the destiny of the tree already present in the acorn? Yeah. I mean, like it's, actually, I remember this in discussion with something that Aristotle said. If you guys don't know why I have Aristotle here, it's because he actually discovered this 2,500 years ago. His writings indicate that he actually was aware of the phenomenon of strong emergence. He just kind of formulated it differently, but he believed that holistic systems themselves have causal power, which is strong emergence. But yeah. Okay. Anyways, thank you so much for